join you today. I'm going to take a broad overview, really sketching in broad brushstrokes some ideas about the genetic and environmental influences on the development of borderline personality disorder. So what I want to do is sort of provide a broad overview, largely as I see it. In many ways, the study of the etiology and etiological structure of borderline personality disorder is moving to an interesting, even exciting stage. Gradually, theoretical speculations about the disorder are being replaced by empirical findings. And these findings are beginning to challenge many of our views about the classification and diagnosis of the condition, about its causes and its development, and also about its treatment. I suppose for many, this sort of state of affairs that we're moving into is a little disconcerting. It's always a little uncomfortable to have cherished views challenged, particularly when they're challenged by facts. But nevertheless, at the same time, it's providing us with new beginnings in the sense that we're beginning to construct a much more solid empirical base for developing ideas about the development of this disorder, which will ultimately have a major impact on our ability to treat the condition and perhaps even lead to some preventative strategies. As we try to form a general understanding of the causes of borderline personality disorder, we need to recognize that the picture is complex. It would be nice if we had a simple ideas about etiology and if the etiology of the disorder were relatively straightforward. But it doesn't seem to be the case. Ideally, when we're studying the causes of a disorder or condition, we want to find a cause that has a big effect. And it would be nice if we could find a cause that had a big effect on borderline. So in medicine, we want to find causes where we can find a particular virus that is responsible for AIDS, or a particular bacillus that is responsible for duodenal ulcers. But that doesn't seem to be the case in borderline. Whether we look at biological factors or psychosocial factors, big causes don't seem to exist. So it's a little disappointing in that sense. Instead, it looks as if multiple factors contribute to the development of borderline personality, so that we can think of many factors contributing to this disorder, ranging from genetic predispositions of various kinds that I'm going to talk about, through environmental factors, some of a biological nature, moving through psychosocial factors to cultural factors. And it looks as if each of these factors has a small effect, and none is necessary or sufficient to cause the disorder. So far, we haven't found anything, apart from general genetic predisposition, that seems to be common to all cases. So the picture is not one that we would like in lots of ways. It's a much more complicated picture. We see this particularly, just to illustrate it, in genetic studies, where interest is there's currently some interest in finding specific genes that are linked to borderline pathology. And one such gene is the serotonin transporter gene, which has been identified as a potential candidate, because evidence suggests that it plays a role in a variety of behaviors that we see in patients with this disorder, role in the trait of neuroticism, which seems to be an important predisposing factor, emotional ability, suicide and impulsive behavior. And a recent study from Toronto group published earlier this year showed that there was an association between one polymorphism in the serotonin transporter gene and borderline personality disorder. And we've known for about 10 years in that world there have been studies showing various links between specific genes and various personality traits. But in general, these links have been difficult to replicate, and in general, they seem to account for relatively small proportions of variants, usually less than 1%, which suggests that each trait that we are interested in borderline pathology is probably going to be influenced by a number of genes, each having relatively small effects. And that seems to be the typical picture, that most of the etiological factors that we study seem to have relatively small effects. There have been times in the history of our field where people have assumed that that's not the case, and we've had theories put forward at various times that the condition was caused by a particular set of factors. Sexual abuse was one of interest in the early 90s, and people suggested that the disorder was really a form of chronic post-traumatic stress disorder. But clearly that picture is far too simplistic, and we're recognizing that a large number of patients now don't have the sort of histories of abuse that one would expect. So in general, we haven't been able to find those sorts of factors, which means that the pathways leading to this disorder, as Dr. Oden was talking about, are likely to be multiple and complex, so that we will find some patients where the etiology looks to be primarily biological. I remember treating some years ago a patient who was extremely distressed because she couldn't identify anything in her past that might have caused the problems that she was having. Her life was chaotic, a typical picture of these patients when acutely distressed, but she couldn't explain it in any other terms than there must be something fundamentally wrong with me. And it seemed as if most of the factors contributing to her particular set of problems were probably more of a biological nature, with the odd psychosocial factor thrown in. Whereas we see other patients currently treating somebody who has a totally different sort of etiological pathway, somebody who's brought up in a culture where tolerance and abuse was not sort of so much accepted, but very common, with a large number of cultural factors which seem to be important, extensive abuse outside the family, starting from an early age, including sexual abuse, and again, some biological vulnerabilities, so that the picture is mixed. So it's likely that this is a syndrome where there are multiple pathways to its development. So if we summarize before I go into details, we can begin to say that the etiology of borderline looks something like this. Genes and environment contribute to the disorder. There's probably no single major cause for borderline. It's not due to a single genetic or environmental factor. It's the result of multiple factors, each having a small effect. We're going to find multiple pathways. And probably as we begin to try to construct an idea of how this disorder develops, we need to understand in detail how genes and environment interplay to give rise to these particular set of problems. So let me now begin to talk about this in more detail and begin to sketch some of the evidence behind these ideas. If we look generally at the etiology of any form of personality disorder, including borderline, it looks roughly as if genetic and environmental factors are contributing equally to the development of this sort of pathology. We know this from the twin studies that John Auden began to talk about earlier. For those of you not familiar with this methodology, we know that by looking at various kinds of twins, we can begin to estimate the relative contribution of genes and environment. To give you an example, if we take a set of identical twins who have exactly the same genes in common, differences between these twins must be due to environmental factors. If, on the other hand, we find that our identical twins are more alike than fraternal twins, we can begin to identify that as due to genetic factors. And by looking at the similarities of identical twins and comparing those with fraternal twins, we can begin mathematically to estimate the relative contributions of genes and environment to a particular disorder or a particular trait. And using the sort of methodology that's been developed, we can estimate then genetic effects, which are referred to in the technical term of heritability, which is simply the proportional variance in a disorder that's explained by genetic factors. And then we can estimate environmental contributions to a disorder, and using twin study methodology, we can split these environmental factors into shared or common effects, that is, experiences that are common to both members of a twin pair. For example, being brought up in the same home, being subjected to the same sorts of common influences. And then there are the non-shared or unique effects, experiences that are specific to one twin. For example, parents or teachers may favour one twin over another. And when we begin to estimate these personality disorders, we find something like this. This is the detailed study by Sven Torgerson. Sorry, his name is dropped off the bottom. John was talking about a few moments ago. And Torgerson has a small sample of twins with psychiatric conditions, about 200 pairs, and these are the estimates of heritability for various DSM disorders. We can see that he's suggesting that borderline has a heritability of about 70%. In other words, genetic factors are contributing about 70% of the variance in borderline pathology. By implication, environmental factors are contributing about 30%. And we see a range ranging from narcissism up in the 80% down to avoidance around about 30%. This range is not typical for that we find in the heritability of most personality characteristics. And it's usually we find that genetic and environmental factors are contributing about equally. Typically, genetic factors seem to account for about 40 to 50% of the variability in a disorder. Torgerson gets a bigger range, probably because he's got a relatively small sample. So when we move away from the disorder itself and begin to look at the subcomponents of borderline, the various traits that make up the disorder, we see a slightly more modest set of genetic factor influences. Let me begin to talk about the genetics of the particular traits that make up borderline by introducing the idea that we can think of borderline not just in terms of the DSM criteria set, as we've heard from Dr. Fordham, they're almost invariably going to be changed over the next little while. Instead, we can begin to adopt a slightly different approach. Instead of taking the concept of borderline and asking what sort of characteristics make up these patients, we can take the whole range of terms that clinicians use to describe personality disorder and look at the way in which these terms cluster statistically. And when we do that, we get a slightly different picture of the borderline syndrome than we do from the DSM. We find the affective lability that the DSM talks about, the attachment problems that we see in these patients, the cognitive dysfunction, identity problems, but we can also begin to isolate the anxiousness that we see in these patients, which is slightly different from the affective lability. And I don't know about what your experiences are with these patients, but most of the ones I treat have high levels of anxiety. It's not that they have an anxiety disorder, they're anxious, they're chronically worried, they get into panic-like anxiety states at times of crisis. Most are also highly submissive, highly dependent, although this doesn't fit into the DSM criteria set. So when we look at this cluster of traits and look at the genetics of these traits, we get something like this. We find that the heritability of these traits is typically in this 40 to 50% range that I talked about. So clearly there's a genetic core or underpinning to this cluster of traits that define the personality characteristics of borderline patients. What is interesting about these analyses is that the common environmental effects, the effects that are common to a particular home, don't seem to be important in modifying personality. Instead, it's the way people are treated differently, these unique effects, that seem to be important in determining personality characteristics. This is interesting because for 50 years, developmental psychologists have studied the impact of families on personality. And yet, in fact, when we look at twin studies, it looks as if the family factors, these common factors in the home, don't have a huge impact. They affect values, they affect beliefs, but they don't seem to modify personality traits. Families don't have the impact on personality structure that they would like to think they have. Instead, it seems to be these unique factors that are important. And if we think about what our patients tell us, this fits in. Our patients get upset by the fact that they were treated differently from somebody else. It's the injustices, the unfairness that seems to be important. It's almost as if we have a built-in, at a biological level, a susceptibility to be very sensitive to the way in which we're treated differently from other people. Years ago, I made the mistake of going into psychiatric administration. John, you should listen to this. I made the mistake of going into psychiatric administration, and one of the things that always puzzled me was people would complain about trivial things. You know, they would come to me and say, you know, I can't stand it. My office is smaller than Dr. So-and-so's next to me. And I would go in and I would look, and I said, no, it looks pretty much the same to me. No, if you get a tape measure out, in actual fact, it's 3 inches shorter. Or I get so many dollars a week less, which becomes peanuts when you take out taxes and all the rest of it. But these tiny things bother people. And when I began to do this twin study work, I realized that this is built in. So the task of an administrator is a hopeless task. You can't win, because biology is working against you. We're sensitive to small differences, and these have a big impact. So I did the wise thing. I gave up psychiatric administration. So this is interesting. I think this has important for us to begin to recognize as clinicians and be perhaps more sensitive to the ways in which people tell us how they're treated differently from other people. Now, when we look at this pattern of traits, we can begin to ask other questions of these traits using behavior genetic techniques. I'm not going to go into the details of these, but I'm going to illustrate the sort of questions we can ask. We can begin to be interested in why traits cluster in this sort of way. We can begin to ask questions about whether the genetic factor that's responsible or contributes to anxiousness is the same as the genetic factor that contributes to affective mobility, and so on down the list. So we can begin to ask whether these traits share a genetic influence in common. And when we do the sort of statistical analyses that allow us to answer those questions, we begin to identify a general genetic factor that seems to contribute to all borderline traits. It's as if there's a suite of genes with no idea what they are or how many are involved that affect all traits in the borderline cluster. So there's something that affects both anxiousness, submissiveness, social avoidance, and so on. And if we think about it, it's probably a set of traits that influence behaviors linked to anxiety, because it's the anxious quality that affects submissiveness. If you're a little bit anxious, you're likely to be more submissive. You're likely to be a little bit socially anxious and so on. So there seems to be a general genetic factor contributing to all those traits. But unfortunately, nature isn't kind to us as investigators, because it doesn't look as if this general factor is the only one influencing borderline traits. Mathematically, we can remove the effects of this factor from each of these traits, and then determine whether there's anything left that is genetically based. I just want to get the concept across and show the findings rather than go into the details. But we can subtract this effect from each of these and see whether there's anything left. And when we do those analyses, we find that in addition to this general factor, it looks as if there's also a specific genetic factor that influences each of these characteristics. In fact, in the case of affective mobility, there seems to be two specific genetic factors influencing affective mobility. one producing an irritable, highly reactive sort of set of behaviors, and the other one producing emotional intensity. It's the strength of the reaction. And they look as if they're slightly different at a genetic level. So the picture begins to get complicated about the genetic etiology of this disorder. And the picture that I want to leave you with is this sort of idea. This is what I think is important. It looks as if we are born with, if you like, a large number of genetic predispositions that begin to influence the structure of our personality. That most of all the major traits that we talk about that make up borderline have a substantial heritable component. A few of these highly specific genetic modules have an organizing effect. They influence other traits in the cluster, so that over time they begin to establish the sorts of patterns that we recognize clinically, one being the borderline or emotional dysregulation pattern of cluster of traits, another being the psychopathic pattern, and another perhaps the more schizoid pattern. So it's almost as if we have a genetic blueprint that's built in that influences the structure of personality. And so it doesn't appear as if the environment makes a huge difference in the structure of personality. Now we know the environment has a big impact. It produces or causes more than 50% of the variants. But what it doesn't seem to do is change the structure of these traits. It looks as if these traits are sort of almost like a genetic blueprint that gets unfolded in the course of development. So what does the environment do? And how does that have an impact? And how does that affect our thinking about the nature of this disorder and its treatment? We know from a large number of studies conducted over many years that a wide range of psychosocial factors contribute to borderline pathology. This is a table from Joe Paris's summary chapter in the Handbook of Personality Disorders, pointing out that there are a variety of family factors that seem to increase the prevalence of this disorder or associated with the disorder, a variety of traumatic deprivation factors. And I mentioned earlier that for a while these were thought to be factors that had a big impact. And then there's also clearly a set of cultural and social factors, because it does look as if the frequency or prevalence of this disorder is increasing a little over time. Each of these factors seems to have a relatively small effect, and none seems to be necessary to cause the disorder. So the interesting question is, how do these factors have an influence? What do they do to personality? How do they give rise to the sorts of behaviors we treat in the patients? So let me begin to talk about what does the environment do, and how might we think about it, how might we build up a picture of how borderline personality disorder develops. The first thing that the environment seems to do is to influence the degree to which a genetic predisposition is expressed. The environment, depending on its nature, can increase the level, it can amplify, if you like, a predisposition, or it can reduce it. There's probably limits to which the environment can operate. It probably can't affect this level of genetic predisposition to give a very high level of trait intensity, and it probably can't reduce it substantially below certain limits. In other words, there's a window of variability under which the environment has an effect. So let me try and illustrate that, and how I think that might help us to understand the development of borderline pathology. If we take this cluster of traits that make up borderline, it looks as if the factors that are really critical, that have the biggest loading, is really the emotional factors, particularly anxiousness and to a lesser degree affective lability. And we can think of this as the core. So the model that I'm putting forward is a little different from that that characterizes some of the models in the literature. Like Linehan, I think that the central component of borderline is emotional dysregulation. And this is the core that drives the rest of the disorder and gives rise to the other sorts of problems that we see. Now we can think of these sort of emotional traits as being the result of producing the sort of typical behaviours we see in these patients, the mood changes, the anger, the rage, the panic-like anxiety that seems to characterise crisis states. And as I've shown, that this pattern seems to be influenced to a substantial degree by genetic factors. During the course of development, as Dr. Oldham has been telling us, other factors begin to influence this sequence. Thomas Rene's work that Dr. Oldham described, which he looked at stress responsivity in patients who have been traumatized, seems to suggest that stress has a biological effect. It produces changes in the biology of the stress response system. So, sorry, the point is gone. Keep working. So it influences the expression of these traits at a biological level. And then as development proceeds, it seems clear also that these traits, the expression of these traits, is also influenced by a number of mechanisms that we can call in a general term emotional regulation mechanisms and skills. A variety of techniques that we've acquired over time that help us to regulate and control our feelings. We've learned that attachment seems to be important in the acquisition of these skills. Attachment relationship is important in the sense that the attachment figure in the early stages of life provides an external way of regulating affect. The child or the infant gets distress, mother responds or the caregiver responds in an intuitive way and settles the infant's distress. So in effect, the caregiver is an external regulator of the child's emotional state. As that pattern gets enacted repeatedly through life, over time, and as the child's memory and cognitive skills develop, the child begins to form an image of mother that will probably help to soothe it when it gets distressed. So there's a sort of an internalization. I hate that word because it tends to be misused, but the individual acquires the sorts of cognitive skills or cognitive things, the memory, that help to soothe it and settle distress. And over time, that gets built and extended into a variety of skills and mechanisms that allow the infant or the child to control and regulate the level of emotional responsivity. We can understand too now how this system begins to affect the overall level of emotionality. We can see how caregivers may be, for various reasons, unable to help the child to acquire these sorts of skills. Perhaps the fit between infant and caregiver isn't as sensitive as one would like for a whole variety of reasons. Perhaps other factors intervene. So we begin to see how the attachment relationship has an impact on these biologically based traits. But it's also clear that other factors are also influencing the regulation of emotions and the sorts of skills and mechanisms that are available. Neurobiological factors of a whole variety of kinds will affect that system and will have an impact on the individual's capacity to regulate and control. So we know from the evidence that there seem to be a number of neurobiological factors that contribute to borderline pathology in at least a percentage of cases. So we see in this picture a very complex interaction between biology and environment, so that it's meaningless to ask whether these behaviours are the results of genes or environment. It's an interplay between the two that's important. It also begins to establish the basis for thinking more rationally about therapy. We can think of using, as we've heard, medications which have an impact on the biology of the stress response system. We can think of medications that facilitate or improve emotional regulation. and the capacity to regulate emotions. But we can also think of the use of a variety of psychosocial interventions designed to enhance the skills and the coping mechanisms that we use to handle our affects. And this is the sort of interventions that Linehan talks about in her various skill-building components, and which cognitive therapy talks about generally in terms of the sorts of belief systems that have an impact on emotional expression, and which also figures in psychodynamic interventions. So we can begin to develop a sort of rationale for combining various kinds of interventions from different schools of thought into an overall treatment model. So that's one thing that the environment seems to do. It modulates the level of expression of these genetically based predispositions. The second thing that the environment does is influence the actual behaviors through which a trait is expressed. In other words, a given trait can be expressed very differently in different people according to their experiences. When I was doing some work about 10 years ago on the genetics of the personality traits, it struck me that there were some interesting parallels between the patient that I was treating at the time and a colleague that I was working with. Both had high levels of stimulus seeking. They both needed excitement. They were both sensation seekers. And we see this, I think, in some patients with borderline pathology. There's this terrific need for excitement. Now, if we take a trait, like a need for stimulation, need for excitement, and think about that, and think about this negative impact on people's behaviour, we've got the problem of what do we do about it, and how might we think about treating this sort of trait. So this time I had a patient who was very high on stimulus seeking. She expressed this need for excitement in a whole variety of ways, but mainly through acting out. By cutting herself, she would typically cut herself on Saturday night, go to the emergency room, and would find the whole experience exciting. To make it even more intensely exciting and stimulating, she would cut herself, put on a t-shirt, cut her breasts, put on a t-shirt and jean jacket, and then go to a nightclub in downtown Vancouver. And after a while, she would pick a fight with a bouncer. And in the course of this fight, the jean jacket would come open, the blood-stained t-shirt would appear, the bouncer would freak out, the nightclub would go into uproar, the police would be called, paramedics would come. And in a way, this was Saturday night entertainment for her. Painful, distressing, and she was dealing with a whole variety of complex affects at the time, and we can see how this sort of behavior was affect regulating, but it was also satisfying this need for excitement. And as she began to improve and gave up this, she came to me one day and said, I can't stand it any longer. I can't tolerate therapy with you. It's just too boring. And she was upset because she hadn't cut. And she went on to list my sins. As a result of your interventions, I no longer cut myself. I've not been arrested for months. I've not spent nights in jail for ages. And I can't stand the boredom. And so this is interesting. What do you do about these sorts of characteristics? The analytic tradition of analysing this away just doesn't work if you've got a biologically based characteristic. It's more complicated. At the same time, I had a colleague who struck me as just the same, but he was a bit more adaptive. What he would do is things like he would play the stock market. And back in the early 80s, he used to play the commodities market, and one day, because it was exciting, one day he made $250,000. He took his wife out to buy a new house, but he didn't take his money out of the market, lost it again a few weeks later, and shortly after that lost his wife as well. But that was all exciting because now he had to find a new one. And I would go and visit him, and he would do things like run his car on empty because the price might just drop over the next, gas might drop over the next few hours. And I used to say to him, look, I will buy the gas for you. I just want to make sure we get to the airport. And he said, no, we can't. But it was exciting to do it. He would go shopping at the supermarket at 15 minutes to midnight. He was a single parent family by this time. He would go shopping at 15 minutes to midnight because the supermarket closed at midnight, and he wanted to see if he could get his week's groceries in 15 minutes. So this was exciting. But it struck me that my patient and he were exactly the same in the level of intensity of this trait. It was just that he'd adopted a slightly, marginally more adaptive way of handling this. So it struck me as we thought about it, is one of the things we might think about with these traits that are at the extremes is not so much changing the trait, because we probably don't have the interventions to do that at the present time, but helping patients to express these traits in much more adaptive ways. And I think that's probably what happens with our patients. Over time they learn adaptive ways of expressing these traits. They learn how to manage their affective ability. They learn to use it and to recognize its strengths and its assets. They learn to use their sensation-seeking needs in order to find things that are satisfying for them. This particular patient went on to develop firstly of all, an interest in high-risk sports, which scared the daylights out of me for a while, because she did things like bungee jumping and jumping out of airplanes. And then later on went into a fairly stimulating sort of job, which seems to satisfy this need for excitement. In other words, she began to do some of the things that my colleague did, an active social life and a stimulating career. So we can think of moving patients over time, not in terms of changing these characteristics, but by helping them to adopt more adaptive ways. And I think this is one of the big ways in which the environment influences personality, is through the actual behaviors through which a trait is expressed. And so we might think, as a result of that, of therapy in slightly different ways than we have done in the past. The picture that I've been trying to paint is a really complex one, of a complex etiology for a complex disorder. That there is a complicated interaction and interplay between genes and environment. We need to remember that it's difficult to disentangle genetic from environmental influences in any sort of convincing way, and recognize that it's the interplay that seems to be important. Genes require an environment to be expressed, and environments are determined also by genes. It's not as simple of things of being separate and independent. And just to illustrate this, I want to draw attention to a really interesting study that was reported by Caspi and his colleagues a few years ago on the gene-environment interaction in the development of antisocial behavior. They noted that childhood maltreatment, especially coercive and punitive parenting, is a major risk factor for conduct disorder, antisocial behavior in boys. But not all maltreated children develop these behaviors. And there's evidence that the monoamine oxidase A gene is associated with aggressive behavior. And in a large sample of children from New Zealand, they found that maltreated children with the genotype associated with high levels of MAOA expression were less likely to develop antisocial behavior. So the interesting feature of this is how complicated the interaction is between genes and environment. And it looks as if there are some genes that actually protect against the effects of adversity. So let me conclude with some ideas about the implications of the sort of picture that's emerging about the etiology of this disorder. It's clear that we need to begin to rethink our ideas of classification and our criteria for the condition. We're going to need to reconceptualize borderline personality disorder to reflect empirical findings. At a theoretical level, we clearly need a new generation of theories to account for the disorder. Theories that are capable of integrating biological with environmental effects. Most theories that we have currently stress the psychosocial origins of the disorder and neglect genetic contributions. All cases are assumed to follow the same developmental pathway. And our theories really don't recognize that there are many different routes to borderline pathology. And finally, as we come to treatment, it looks as if etiological research is suggesting the importance of adopting an eclectic and integrated approach to treatment that recognizes and accommodates the diverse causes of this condition. we're moving beyond the questions of whether transference-based therapy is more important or less important than dialectical behavior therapy, to beginning to ask important questions about what sort of treatment work for what sort of problems. So we need to begin to think of the different treatment strategies and different treatment models. Our current theories are largely based on an assumed psychosocial etiology. Most of our treatments aren't sufficiently comprehensive enough to deal with the whole range of problems we see in typical cases. So we get borderline treated as if it was a problem of affect regulation, whether it was a problem of difficulty with mentalizing, it's a problem with disturbed interpersonal relationships, or maladaptive cognitions, or identity problems. In fact, borderline is all those. And so we need treatment strategies that accommodate that range of pathology. None of our current therapies do that. Thank you.